Welcome to this explainer. Today we're cracking open one of the absolute most fascinating texts to survive from the ancient world. Now, on the surface, the Sumerian King List just looks like a straightforward, albeit very old, spreadsheet. A simple tally of cities, kings, and the years they ruled in southern Mesopotamia. But when we actually look a little closer, we find out that this ancient clay tablet was basically a masterclass in political spin. It is an incredible piece of ideological propaganda that was constantly rewritten to justify whoever happened to be holding the sword at the time. Okay, let's dive right into this and see how history was quite literally rewritten. So take a look at this massive number, 43,200. In our modern minds, that sounds like the timeline for human evolution, right? Or maybe an entire geological epic. But in the Sumerian King List, this number represents something way more astonishing: the length of a single reign. According to the text, this is exactly how many years one single mythical king, a guy named Enmenluana, sat on the throne. To understand why an ancient scribe would carve such an absolutely absurd number into clay, we need to take a look at how this whole document is structured. Section 1. The Impossible Ancient Kings. Diving into the earliest claims of the list, we see a timeline that is completely detached from human reality. This first section deals entirely with the era before a great mythical flood swept over the land. In the very first part of the best-preserved version, we're introduced to a lineup of 8 kings ruling over 5 ancient cities. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the impossible math. When you add up the reigns of just these 8 men, you get a mind-boggling total of 241,200 years. The scribes were using a sexagesimal numbering system, which is based on the number 60, to calculate these vast, mathematically derived time spans. It's totally fictional for sure, but as we'll see in a minute, it wasn't a mistake. It was a very deliberate choice. Section 2. Discovering the real rulers. Then, suddenly, the text tells us that the flood swept over. After this catastrophic reset, the era of the impossibly long-lived kings ends, and we transition into the post-flood era. When we juxtapose those pre-flood kings with the rulers who came later, the shift is honestly pretty jarring. On one side, we've got mythical kings like Enmenlu ruling for tens of thousands of years with absolutely zero archaeological footprint. And then on the other side, we have figures like Enmebaragesi of Kish. Now, the king list claims he ruled for 900 years, which, okay, is obviously still a massive exaggeration. But here's the amazing part. He actually existed. We have physically recovered contemporary inscriptions from the Early Dynastic I period that bear his name. So the list is seamlessly blending purely mythological characters with genuine, historically verifiable rulers. Section 3. Claiming divine royal authority. Which brings us to the big curtain reveal question, doesn't it? Why? Why would ancient scribes mix pure fiction, guys ruling for 40,000 years, with the very real historical figures who actually built their temples and fought their wars? What's the strategic value of this ancient manuscript? Well, to answer that, we have to understand the power of the antediluvian era, the time before the flood. In the Mesopotamian worldview, this was a primordial, divinely sanctioned time. So the absolute crucial point is this: by tethering actual mortal kings to these godlike antediluvian figures, you established a mandate from heaven. You aren't just some guy who conquered a city with a bronze sword. No, you are the latest link in an unbroken chain of authority stretching all the way back to the dawn of creation. In fact, this is famously how the entire list opens. After the kingship descended from heaven, this brilliant opening line sets the terms for everything that follows. It emphasizes that kingship wasn't just some political office you could win through warfare or clever diplomacy. It was a sacred, divine gift. It was a physical institution bestowed upon a chosen city by the gods themselves. And most importantly, according to the ideology of this text, it could only ever reside in one city at a time. Section 4. Cyclical myth versus linear reality. That idea of a single moving kingship is literally the beating heart of the document. If you read the text, you'll hear this rhythmic anchor text repeated over and over again. Then Kish was defeated and the kingship was taken to Uruk. Then Uruk was defeated and the kingship was taken to Ur. And this brilliantly illustrates how the document visualizes a really neat, orderly transfer of power. It creates this cyclical pattern where one city rises, falls, and seamlessly hands the baton of divine authority right to the next one. Let's move to and see how this builds into an incredibly clean progression. Eridu rules, then Bad Tabira, then Shuruppak, then Kish, then Uruk. It basically presents the history of ancient Mesopotamia as an idealized, linear succession of a single monarchy. But, as we all know, history, especially ancient history, is rarely ever this polite or organized. When we actually check this neat timeline against the archaeological record, we find a much messier reality. We see overlapping reigns and wildly unequal power dynamics. For example, the King List implies a perfectly sequential passing of the torch between Lugal-Zagassi of Uruk and the famous Sargon of Akkad. In reality, they were contemporary rulers who lived at the exact same time. Sargon actually founded his Akkadian empire by violently overthrowing Lugal-Zagassi. Mesopotamia was a landscape of messy, simultaneous city-states constantly vying for dominance. It definitely wasn't a polite queue of kings waiting their turn for the divine mandate.
Section 5. The ultimate political propaganda.
So, knowing that the document intentionally flattens and reshapes history, we arrive at our final takeaway. The Sumerian King List isn't a history textbook. It's essentially the ultimate how-to manual for ancient dictators looking to legitimize their conquests. The question we must always ask ourselves when analyzing historical sources like this is, who benefits? If a scribe is going through the immense trouble of redacting and altering ancient king lists to create a single continuous line of succession, they're doing it for a patron. They are interrogating the past to serve the present. And the historical record shows us exactly which dynasties manipulated this text for their own personal gain.
The playbook was incredibly effective. Step 1, conquer the region. Step 2, redact the old king lists. Step 3, insert your dynasty at the very end as the sole divine heir. Scholars believe the Akkadian dynasty first created a version of this list to position themselves as the direct heirs to the ancient hegemony of Kish. Centuries later, following the collapse of the really powerful III state, the İZan dynasty took the text, rearranged it, and added to it. They used the list to literally write themselves into the sacred DNA of Sumerian history. We see this perfectly in the most famous physical copy of the text, known as the Weld-Blundell prism. It's absolutely no coincidence that this beautifully preserved artifact ends perfectly with the İZan dynasty. By tacking themselves onto the very end of a list that starts way back before the flood, the rulers of İZan were sending a super clear message. Our current rule isn't just a political reality, it is an inevitable divine destiny. We belong on this list just as much as the demigods of old. The Sumerian King List shows us that history has always been a highly malleable tool in the hands of those with power. They crafted a narrative that turned the chaotic, messy violence of competing city-states into a divinely ordained logical progression, ensuring their own reign appeared unshakable. But it leaves us with a pretty compelling thought to end on today. If an ancient king could literally invent 241,000 years of history simply to justify their crown, what modern historical narratives are functioning the exact same way today? Are the histories we take for granted just as meticulously curated by the victors? Thank you so much for joining this explainer and keep questioning the story.